In the chaos of post-war Germany, something unprecedented happened in prisoner of war camps. German soldiers were hunting and killing other German soldiers, specifically any man who had served in one particular SS unit. These weren't summary executions by Allied forces or acts of revenge by liberated prisoners. Wehrmacht veterans and SS men, who had fought for years on the Eastern Front, deliberately targeted their own countrymen because they refused to share captivity with them. The unit they hunted bore the name of its commander, the Dirlewanger Brigade. The SS prided itself on racial purity and elite standards, yet in 1940, Heinrich Himmler personally ordered the release of 55 convicted poachers from German prisons for a special military experiment. These weren't ordinary prisoners. Each man had violated German hunting laws with firearms in hand, demonstrating both marksmanship and a willingness to break the law violently. The Nazi high command, particularly Himmler and his subordinate Gottlob Berger, saw potential in these convicted men. They believed that those who had stalked game through German forests possessed exactly the skills needed for a different kind of hunting, tracking down partisan fighters in the occupied territories of Eastern Europe. The unit was initially designated as the Wilddiebkommando Oranienburg, the Oranienburg Poachers Unit. The location was significant. Oranienburg housed one of the Nazi regime's concentration camps, and the force would operate under the authority of the SS Totenkopfverbände, the Death's Head units responsible for concentration camps and anti-partisan operations. From its very first day, this group existed outside normal military structure. The poachers were released on one condition: serve in this special unit or return to prison. There would be no civilian life, no transfer to conventional military service. The most revealing aspect of this experiment wasn't the recruitment of poachers, it was the choice of commander. Heinrich Himmler and Gottlob Berger needed someone who embodied what they were building. They chose Oskar Dirlewanger, a World War I veteran who was himself a convicted sex offender and habitual lawbreaker. The SS, which supposedly maintained the strictest standards of racial and moral purity in Nazi Germany, handed command of an official unit to a convicted predator. Dirlewanger had earned a doctorate in political science from Frankfurt University in 1922, a detail that makes his subsequent career all the more chilling. This wasn't an uneducated brute who knew nothing else. He was an educated man who chose brutality. His dissertation had examined economic planning, and he would later apply that same methodical thinking to the organization of mass violence. The trenches of World War I hadn't instilled honor or discipline. He emerged from that war with a capacity for violence and a complete disregard for civilian life. His leadership philosophy was brutally simple: unleash violence against civilian populations to terrorize resistance movements into submission. Where conventional commanders would have court-martialed soldiers for atrocities against civilians, Dirlewanger rewarded them. He maintained control over his men, not through military structure, but through personal brutality and fear. Those under his command understood that he was more dangerous than they were, more willing to commit violence, more completely unrestrained by any moral consideration. Yet Dirlewanger's most important asset wasn't his brutality, it was his patrons. Heinrich Himmler and Gottlob Berger repeatedly protected him from consequences. As reports of atrocities began filtering back from the Eastern Front, as complaints mounted from Wehrmacht officers and other SS commanders, Himmler and Berger intervened. They shielded Dirlewanger from investigation, dismissed accusations against him, and ensured that the unit could continue operating despite mounting evidence of its depravity. This protection wasn't accidental. The Nazi leadership knew exactly what Dirlewanger was doing. They protected him because he was doing exactly what they wanted. The relationship between Dirlewanger and his patrons revealed something crucial about the Nazi regime's approach to occupied territories. The unit wasn't a mistake or an aberration. It was policy. The Nazi leadership deliberately chose a convicted predator to lead other offenders in operations against civilian populations because they wanted the terror that would result. They wanted populations in occupied territories to fear German forces so completely that resistance would become unthinkable. Dirlewanger's background and sadistic tendencies weren't disqualifications for command, they were his resume. Most military units maintain standards to preserve effectiveness, but the Dirlewanger Brigade did the opposite. It grew by systematically recruiting the most unstable and violent men available. The initial poaching unit had been a test case. When it proved willing to commit the atrocities the Nazi leadership wanted, the decision was made to expand it dramatically. Throughout the early 1940s, German prisons were scoured for men who could join. The recruitment criteria evolved. Poachers were no longer sufficient. The unit began accepting other convicted offenders: thieves, assaulters, those imprisoned for violent crimes. By 1942, the unit had expanded enough to be redesignated as the SS Sonderregiment Dirlewanger, a special regiment bearing its commander's name. The expansion continued. As Germany's military situation deteriorated and manpower became scarce, the recruitment standards, such as they were, collapsed entirely. The unit began incorporating Eastern European collaborators, men from occupied territories willing to fight for the Nazi regime. Soviet prisoners of war were offered a choice: join the Dirlewanger unit or remain in camps where death from starvation and disease was nearly certain. Many chose the unit. The incorporation of Soviet POWs created a bizarre dynamic within the force. Men who had been fighting against the Nazi regime months earlier now served alongside German convicts in operations against civilian populations. The Soviets had their own reasons for joining, survival being paramount, but their presence meant the unit contained men with no ideological commitment to Nazi Germany whatsoever. They were there because the alternative was death, and they would commit atrocities because that was what survival required. The most disturbing expansion came in the final years. Documented cases exist of mentally ill patients being recruited into the ranks. Men who had been institutionalized, who suffered from psychological conditions that made them unpredictable and dangerous, were released into Dirlewanger's command. By 1945, this collection numbered approximately 4,000 men: German convicts, Eastern European collaborators, desperate Soviet prisoners, and mentally ill patients. The term soldiers barely applied. Despite its growing infamy and dysfunction, the Nazi leadership not only continued the experiment, but elevated it. In November 1944, the unit was officially recognized as the SS Sturm Brigade Dirlewanger. 3 months later, in February 1945, as Germany was collapsing on all fronts, the regime redesignated it again as the 36th Waffen-Grenadier Division der SS, granting it the status of a full division. This final designation was absurd. The unit lacked the structure, training, and discipline of an actual military division. Yet the Nazi leadership continued to invest in the experiment even as the war was clearly lost. The expansion showed something important about the Nazi regime's priorities. Resources were devoted to maintaining and expanding a unit whose primary function was terrorizing civilians. The Dirlewanger Brigade wasn't a wartime expedient that got out of hand. It was a deliberate, sustained commitment to weaponized violence that the Nazi leadership maintained until the regime's final days. In the hierarchy of Nazi military units, one stood completely apart, so violent and unpredictable that German commanders had to post guards not to protect them, but to protect everyone else from them. The brigade's reputation spread throughout German forces on the Eastern Front, and that reputation was uniquely terrible. Wehrmacht officers who had spent years fighting a brutal war, SS commanders who had overseen anti-partisan operations across occupied territories, hardened veterans who had witnessed the worst of the Eastern Front, all recognized that the Dirlewanger unit was different. Other SS units received unprecedented orders regarding the brigade. They were instructed to stand ready in case Dirlewanger troops turned on their own German leaders or on neighboring units. The SS command structure didn't trust the brigade to remain loyal to its own side. German commanders had to plan for the possibility that this unit might suddenly attack fellow Germans. This wasn't standard military precaution. This was a unique acknowledgement that the brigade was as dangerous to German forces as it was to enemy populations. The precaution wasn't paranoia. The unit's lack of military discipline and its composition made it genuinely unpredictable. Dirlewanger maintained control through fear, but that control was never absolute. The men under his command had demonstrated a willingness to commit violence against anyone, including authority figures. German commanders operating near the brigade had to treat it as a potential threat, not an allied force. Wehrmacht personnel documented their shock at Dirlewanger atrocities in letters and reports that survived the war. One account described brigade members casually discussing their methods over meals, treating the killing of civilians as entertainment rather than duty. Another report noted that Dirlewanger men would sometimes compete with each other, not for military objectives, but to see who could inflict more suffering. Officers who submitted formal complaints found their reports disappearing into bureaucratic silence, blocked by Himmler's protection. The internal dynamics of the unit were equally disturbing. Dirlewanger didn't just tolerate violence among his own men, he encouraged it. Disputes were settled through fighting. Discipline was maintained through public beatings. Men who showed hesitation in operations were singled out for humiliation or worse. The unit functioned less like a military formation and more like a criminal gang, with Dirlewanger as the most violent gang leader of all. The unit became a pariah among German forces well before the war ended. Other units refused to associate with them. Officers complained about their presence. Soldiers who served in conventional Wehrmacht or SS units wanted nothing to do with Dirlewanger's men. This rejection would become crucial in the war's aftermath. When the Polish Home Army rose up in Warsaw in August 1944, the Nazi response was calculated. They sent not their best troops, but their worst, with implicit permission to do whatever it took to break the city's will. The Warsaw Uprising began on August 1, 1944, as Soviet forces approached the city from the east. The Polish Home Army, the underground resistance movement, loyal to the Polish government in exile in London, launched a coordinated operation to liberate Warsaw before the Soviets arrived. The Poles hoped to establish their own authority over the capital and prevent the Soviet Union from installing a communist puppet government. The timing was both strategic and tragic. The Polish Home Army had waited years for this moment, building an underground network of fighters, stockpiling weapons, and planning for the day they could liberate their capital. They believed Soviet forces would assist them, or at least that the German garrison would be too weak to resist. They were wrong on both counts. The Soviets halted their advance on the eastern bank of the Vistula River and watched. The Germans responded with overwhelming force. The Nazi leadership viewed the uprising as both a military threat and an opportunity. They needed to crush the rebellion to maintain control of Warsaw. But they also wanted to send a message to other occupied populations about the cost of resistance. The Wehrmacht and SS had multiple units available for deployment. They could have sent conventional military forces trained in urban combat. Instead, they made a deliberate choice. They sent the Dirlewanger Brigade. The deployment was calculated. Heinrich Himmler knew exactly what the brigade was and what it would do when unleashed on an urban civilian population. The unit had spent years in anti-partisan operations across Belarus and other occupied territories. It had developed a reputation for extreme brutality, for methods that went far beyond what was necessary for military objectives. The Nazi leadership selected this force specifically because they wanted Warsaw's populations to experience maximum terror. Accompanying the Dirlewanger Brigade was another notorious formation, the Kaminsky Brigade, composed of anti-Soviet Russian collaborators with their own reputation for brutality. Together, these units would be responsible for some of the worst atrocities of the entire war. Warsaw's civilians had no warning that they would face forces specifically composed of violent offenders and collaborators with nothing to lose. In Warsaw's Wola district, the brigade transformed urban combat into systematic slaughter, moving street by street, building by building, killing civilians in numbers that shocked Nazi officials observing from a distance. Wola was a working-class district in western Warsaw, densely populated with residential buildings, small businesses, and civilian infrastructure. When the brigade entered Wola in early August 1944, they didn't engage in conventional urban combat against Polish Home Army fighters. They conducted organized massacres. The methodology was systematic. The brigade would surround a residential area and order all inhabitants out of their buildings. Civilians who complied were gathered in courtyards, streets, or open areas. Then they were executed en masse. Survivors described being lined up against walls while Dirlewanger's men fired into the crowds. They described watching their neighbors, their families, their children shot down in groups. The executions weren't spontaneous acts of violence by individual soldiers. They were organized operations carried out methodically across multiple locations over several days. Wola's geography worked against its residents. The district's grid of streets and apartment blocks created natural killing zones. Once the brigade cordoned off an area, there was nowhere for civilians to flee. Cellars that families hoped would provide shelter became traps when the buildings above were set ablaze. The narrow courtyards where residents had once gathered became execution grounds. Warsaw civilian survivors provided detailed testimonies that were recorded after the war. These accounts describe not just the killings, but the deliberate cruelty that accompanied them. Women were raped before being killed. Elderly civilians were beaten and tortured. Children were not spared. The brigade operated without any restraint whatsoever, treating Wola's civilian population as targets for whatever violence they wished to inflict. Among all the atrocities committed, one method became uniquely associated with the brigade: the deliberate burning alive of civilians trapped in buildings. This wasn't a tactic used once in desperation. It was repeated across multiple locations throughout Warsaw and in earlier operations. The consistency of the method, reported by numerous survivors from different areas, proved it was systematic rather than isolated. The process was deliberate. Dirlewanger's men would force civilians into enclosed spaces, barns, churches, residential buildings, any structure that could be secured. They would pack as many people as possible into these spaces, creating overcrowded conditions where escape would be difficult. Then they would bar the doors from the outside, trapping everyone inside. Survivors who escaped described hearing the doors being secured, hearing wood being piled against the exits, hearing the preparations for what was coming. Then the fires would be set. Some survivors escaped through windows or gaps in walls. Others survived because they were positioned near areas where smoke could escape, allowing them to breathe long enough for the fires to burn out. Most who were herded into those buildings died, and they died in agony. The brigade also forced Warsaw civilians to walk ahead of them during combat, turning mothers, children, and elderly into human shields against Polish Home Army fighters. Polish resistance fighters faced an impossible choice: shoot through their own people to hit the German forces behind them, or hold fire and allow the brigade to advance unopposed. Many resistance fighters couldn't bring themselves to fire on civilians. The brigade exploited this moral restraint ruthlessly, advancing behind crowds of civilians and using them as mobile cover against Polish positions. By October 1944, Warsaw was crushed. The uprising had lasted 63 days. Approximately 200,000 Polish civilians were dead, with a significant portion killed by the Dirlewanger and Kamiński brigades. The surviving population was expelled from the city, and German demolition teams systematically destroyed what remained of Warsaw's buildings. Hitler had ordered that the city be razed to the ground as punishment for the uprising. The brigade had fulfilled its mission of terror. As Nazi Germany's military situation collapsed in late 1944 and early 1945, the brigade's 4,000-strong force was deployed to conventional combat operations across Slovakia, Hungary, and Germany. The Eastern Front was crumbling. Soviet forces were advancing on multiple fronts. The Wehrmacht and SS needed every available unit for desperate defensive battles. The Dirlewanger Brigade, despite its reputation and composition, was thrown into combat against organized enemy forces. The unit proved catastrophically unprepared for actual military combat. In Warsaw, they had faced resistance fighters operating with limited weapons and ammunition, mixed with a civilian population they could terrorize at will. Now they faced the Soviet Red Army, coordinated military operations by professional soldiers with artillery support, armor, and air power. The composition that had made them effective at terrorizing civilians made them completely ineffective as soldiers. Military discipline matters in combat. Training matters. Unit cohesion matters. The brigade had none of these. It was a collection held together by fear of their commander and the opportunity to commit violence against defenseless people. When faced with an enemy that could fight back effectively, the unit's lack of military fundamentals became fatal. They couldn't execute coordinated maneuvers. They couldn't maintain defensive positions under sustained assault. They couldn't function as an effective military force because they had never been trained or organized as one. The contrast with their Warsaw operations was stark. In urban warfare against civilians, the brigade's lack of discipline didn't matter. There was no organized resistance to exploit their weaknesses. Against Soviet forces, every flaw became a death sentence. Units that failed to coordinate with their flanks were surrounded and destroyed. Positions held by men who had no understanding of defensive tactics were overrun within hours. The brigade's destruction wasn't a single catastrophic battle. It was a grinding process of attrition across multiple fronts. In Slovakia, they were thrown into defensive positions against advancing Soviet forces and suffered heavy casualties. In Hungary, they were committed to desperate counterattacks that failed and left hundreds dead. In Germany itself, as the Red Army crossed into the Reich's territory, the remaining brigade elements were consumed in the final battles. Desertion rates climbed. Entire groups simply disappeared from the unit's ranks, fleeing the front rather than face Soviet forces. The men who had enthusiastically participated in massacring civilians had no interest in dying in conventional warfare. Many of the Soviet POWs who had been pressed into service saw an opportunity to escape and took it, some surrendering to Soviet forces and accepting whatever punishment awaited them, rather than continue fighting for the Germans. The Nazi leadership's decision to commit the brigade to conventional combat represented a final irony. They had created a unit specifically for terrorizing civilians. Then, in desperation, they threw this force into conventional military battles for which it was completely unsuited. The result was predictable. The unit was systematically destroyed. By war's end, the vast majority of men who had served in the brigade were dead from combat operations. The annihilation was so complete that the unit essentially ceased to exist as an organized force before Germany's surrender. In POW camps across occupied Germany, something unprecedented was happening. German soldiers were identifying and killing other German soldiers, specifically anyone who had worn the Dirlewanger Brigade uniform. This wasn't random camp violence. This wasn't spontaneous fights between prisoners. This was deliberate hunting of specific individuals because of their unit affiliation. German prisoners who had fought in Wehrmacht units, even those who had served in other SS formations, refused to associate with Dirlewanger survivors. Soldiers knew what the unit had done in Warsaw. When the war ended and these soldiers found themselves in POW camps together, some decided that sharing captivity with Dirlewanger men was intolerable. The mechanism of identification varied. Some Dirlewanger survivors were recognized by men who had served near them during the war. Others were identified by their unit tattoos or markings. Still others were betrayed by fellow prisoners who had heard them discussing their service. Once identified, they became targets. The targeting of fellow Germans by Germans was unprecedented in scope. POW camps held men from all branches of German military service: Wehrmacht soldiers, SS men from various divisions, Luftwaffe personnel, Kriegsmarine sailors. These men had all served Nazi Germany. They had all fought for the regime. Yet they drew a line at the Dirlewanger Brigade. They identified survivors from the unit and attacked them. In some cases, they killed them. The camp guards, whether American, British, French, or Polish, often did nothing to intervene. Some accounts suggest that guards who learned what the Dirlewanger Brigade had done deliberately looked the other way when attacks occurred. The justice being dispensed was rough, but few felt sympathy for its recipients. Among those killed by his own countrymen was Oskar Dirlewanger himself. He survived the systematic annihilation of his brigade, survived the collapse of Nazi Germany, and reached captivity alive. The competing accounts of his death reflect the chaos of the immediate post-war period. Some sources claim he died in a Soviet prison. Other accounts suggest he was killed while in Allied custody. The most credible historical evidence indicates that he was captured and beaten to death by fellow German POWs, or possibly Polish guards, who recognized him and refused to allow him to survive alongside them in captivity. His body was reportedly found with extensive injuries consistent with a prolonged beating. He had been denied even the quick death he had denied so many others. The man who had commanded the burning of civilians alive, who had presided over mass executions and systematic rape, died not in combat and not by Allied justice, but murdered by men who had fought for the same regime and finally decided that some acts were unforgivable. The Dirlewanger Brigade's trajectory from formation to annihilation reveals something important about the nature of weaponized cruelty. The Nazi regime believed it could harness violence by removing all restraints, that convicted predators could be useful tools if pointed at the right targets. The experiment seemed to work in Warsaw, but what the Nazis created couldn't be controlled, couldn't be sustained, and ultimately destroyed itself. The unit's ineffectiveness in conventional combat wasn't incidental. The same qualities that made them willing to commit atrocities against civilians, the absence of discipline, the inability to follow orders that didn't promise immediate gratification, the complete disregard for human life, including their own, made them useless as soldiers. You cannot train men to be monsters and then expect them to function as a military unit. The brutality the Nazis cultivated consumed its practitioners. More striking was the rejection by fellow Germans, men who had participated in the brutal warfare of the Eastern Front, who had served in SS formations that committed their own atrocities, looked at the Dirlewanger Brigade and saw something beyond the pale. This wasn't moral awakening. Many of these men had blood on their own hands. It was something more primal, a recognition that certain behaviors mark someone as outside the bounds of humanity entirely. The Dirlewanger survivors weren't just enemies to be defeated. They were contaminants to be eliminated. The post-war killings suggest that there are limits to moral degradation, even in total war. Not legal limits, those had already failed. Not institutional limits, the Nazi state had removed those deliberately, but limits enforced by the perpetrator's own peers, who decided that sharing space with certain people was intolerable. The Dirlewanger Brigade crossed those limits so completely that their own countrymen became their executioners. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the brigade's story is how thoroughly the Nazi leadership understood what they were creating. This wasn't bureaucratic oversight or a program that spun out of control. Himmler and Berger knew they were unleashing convicted predators on civilian populations. They knew Dirlewanger's methods. They protected him precisely because those methods served their purposes. The horror of Warsaw wasn't a failure of the system. It was the system working exactly as designed. The Dirlewanger Brigade stands as evidence that weaponizing human cruelty is not a sustainable strategy. The terror tactics that seemed effective against civilians produced a force that couldn't survive contact with an actual military opponent. The removal of moral restraints that enabled Warsaw's massacres created men so despised that their own compatriots hunted them in captivity. The experiment in organized savagery consumed itself, destroyed in combat, rejected by their own people, and erased from existence by the very soldiers who had fought under the same flag. What remains is a warning that deliberate brutality has a cost beyond its immediate victims, that the degradation of perpetrators is as certain as the suffering of their targets, and that some lines, once crossed, invite judgment not just from enemies or history, but from those who stood on the same side and finally said, "Not them."